The police stood in my kitchen at 8:30 in the morning. My husband wouldn't look at me. And somehow, I didn't feel relieved. I thought I would feel victorious, or angry, or at least satisfied that the truth had finally landed where it belonged. Instead, what I felt was quiet, heavy, like something had ended long before the officers ever knocked on my door. If you're listening to this expecting a story about revenge, this isn't that. If you're waiting for a moment where I raise my voice or slam a door, it never comes. What happened changed my life, but not in the way people usually expect. Let me slow this down and bring you back to the moment just before everything cracked open. 3 months earlier, my husband told me his business partner needed a place to stay. Just temporarily. A few weeks, maybe a month. She had just moved to the city, deals were in motion, and hotels were expensive. We had a guest room. I didn't hesitate. That's important. I didn't hesitate. I was the kind of woman who believed that trust, once earned, should be given freely. I believe marriage meant you made space for inconvenience, for ambition, for other people's needs. I believe that if something felt uncomfortable, it was usually my responsibility to examine why. So when she moved in, I told myself it was fine. Her suitcase stayed by the door longer than expected. Her toothbrush appeared beside his. Her voice started filling the house in ways I hadn't prepared for. Still, I adjusted. And then one night, 3 months later, my husband looked at me, not angrily, not even defensively, and said something I will never forget. "She's my real wife," he said. "You're just the nanny." Not shouted, not whispered, just stated, like a correction. I packed a bag quietly that night. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I didn't ask questions I already knew the answers to. I folded my clothes with the same care I always had. I left before dawn, believing that walking away was the only dignity I still owned. I thought that was the end of it. I thought leaving would give me peace. I thought silence would be my closure. But the next morning, while I was still figuring out where to sit with my coffee and my thoughts, my phone rang. Then again, and finally, a knock echoed through the empty house I had returned to collect the rest of my things. 2 police officers. Calm, professional, asking for me by name. That's when I realized something important. This wasn't going to feel like a win. And whatever truth they were carrying, it wasn't going to restore what I'd lost. If you're still listening, I want you to stay with me, not because this story ends cleanly, but because understanding came later than pain. And what I learned about myself mattered more than what they learned about him. Let me take you back to who I was before any of this made sense. Before any of this happened, my life felt stable. Not perfect. Not exciting in the way people post online. But solid. Predictable in a way I took comfort in. I was married to a man I thought I knew. We had routines that fit together easily. Morning coffee at the same time, shared calendars, quiet dinners that didn't require conversation to feel full. We lived in a modest house with 1 guest room and a small backyard I kept meaning to turn into something nicer. I worked part-time and handled most of the home logistics. He ran his business and carried himself like someone who was always just one good deal away from something bigger. I believed in us. That's the simplest way to say it. I believed marriage was a long game. That it wasn't about constant reassurance or fireworks, but about showing up consistently. I believed that loyalty didn't need daily proof. It lived in patterns, not promises. And because I believed those things, I didn't monitor him. I didn't check his phone. I didn't question late nights or sudden work trips. I thought doing so would say more about my insecurity than his behavior. That trust shaped everything. Our home was quiet in the evenings, sometimes too quiet. But I told myself that was adulthood, that comfort replaced excitement, and that was okay. I took pride in being adaptable, in being the person who could make space without complaint. If something felt off, my first instinct was always to look inward. Was I being too sensitive? Too rigid? Expecting too much? So when he mentioned his business partner for the first time, I barely reacted. He spoke about her casually, efficiently. She was capable, driven, essential to the expansion he was planning. Her name came up more often as the weeks passed, but always in the same tone he used for numbers and timelines. I pictured someone older, confident, temporary. When he said she needed a place to stay while she got settled, I didn't feel threatened. I felt practical. We had the space. Hotels were expensive. It made sense. I remember standing in the doorway of the guest room that afternoon, mentally listing what I needed to change. Fresh sheets, extra hangers, clearing the desk. I approached it the way I approach most things in my marriage, as a problem to solve, not a moment to question. She arrived with 2 suitcases and a laptop bag. Polite, warm. She thanked me more than once. She made eye contact when she spoke. That mattered to me. It still does. The first few weeks passed without incident. We shared meals sometimes. Other times she and my husband worked late behind closed doors. I noticed, but I didn't dwell. I told myself this was what support looked like. I was proud of how flexible I was being. Looking back, I can see how much of my identity was wrapped around being reasonable. Reasonable wives don't ask unnecessary questions. Reasonable women don't assume betrayal. Reasonable people don't disrupt progress with discomfort. That belief kept me calm and quiet. There were moments, though, small ones, easy to dismiss. A pause before he answered certain questions. A look they shared that lingered a second too long. Inside jokes I wasn't part of. Nothing concrete. Nothing I could point to without feeling foolish. And every time that faint discomfort surfaced, I smoothed it over internally. I reminded myself that trust was a choice I had already made. Now let me ask you something before I go further. Have you ever had that gut feeling that something was off, but you ignored it because you didn't want to believe it? Tell me in the comments. I want to know I'm not alone in this. The night everything shifted didn't announce itself. There was no argument, no raised voice, just a small contradiction that lodged itself somewhere I couldn't shake. I asked him how long she planned to stay. He answered too quickly, and the timeline didn't match what he'd said before. I smiled. I nodded. I let it go. But something inside me paused, just briefly, as if a quiet internal voice had said, "Remember this." At the time, I didn't know why. That pause stayed with me longer than I expected. It wasn't loud. It didn't demand attention. It just sat there, quietly, like a note I hadn't filed away yet. I went about my days the same way I always had: errands, work, dinner, small talk. From the outside, nothing had changed. Inside, I felt myself becoming more observant without meaning to. I started noticing patterns instead of moments. He became more careful with his words, but less consistent. Details shifted. Explanations shortened. When I asked neutral questions, the kind I'd always asked, his answers came with a slight edge, like he was bracing for something I hadn't said. I told myself it was stress, business pressure, deadlines. I didn't want to be the kind of person who interrogated her own life. The first real crack came on an ordinary afternoon. I was folding laundry in the living room when I realized her things had begun to migrate. A sweater on the back of a chair, shoes near the door, a mug she used every morning, placed exactly where his usually Saturday. None of it was dramatic, but it was settled. Guests don't settle. They pass through. That thought made me uncomfortable, so I corrected it. I reminded myself she was staying longer than planned. That happened. People adjusted. I was good at adjusting. Later that evening, I overheard them talking in the kitchen. I wasn't trying to listen. Their voices just carried. They were discussing something personal, not business. The tone was light, familiar. He laughed in a way I hadn't heard in a while. Not with me, at least. I stood still longer than I meant to, telling myself it was fine, that laughter wasn't evidence. But when she said his name, softly, without urgency, something shifted again. I didn't confront either of them. I didn't even enter the room. I walked away, annoyed at myself for reading into things. Still, that night, sleep didn't come easily. My mind replayed small details, not as accusations, but as questions. I started wondering when my role in my own home had changed. A few days later, I needed to use his laptop. Mine had died mid-task, and his was already open on the desk. We'd always shared devices. Passwords weren't secrets between us. I hesitated for half a second, not because I planned to snoop, but because something about touching his things suddenly felt like crossing an invisible line. The screen was open to a messaging app. I saw her name. I didn't read everything. I didn't need to. The timestamps alone told me enough. Messages late at night. Early mornings. Conversations that didn't pause when she walked into the room because they had already continued elsewhere. I closed the laptop immediately. My hands were steady, which surprised me. I told myself I wasn't sure what I'd seen. That context mattered. That work partnerships blurred lines sometimes. Still, the A in the house felt different after that. He felt different. I began to pull back, not in anger, but in self-protection. I spoke less. I listened more. I watched how he looked at her when he thought no one noticed. How she moved through the house with increasing confidence. How decisions were made without me and explained later as afterthoughts. No one said anything outright. That was the most unsettling part. The truth seemed to exist in a space no one wanted to name, and I was expected to coexist with it quietly. I questioned myself constantly. Was I imagining intimacy where there was only familiarity? Was I projecting insecurity onto convenience? I didn't want to become someone who saw betrayal everywhere just because she felt displaced. So I waited. And waiting, I learned, can be its own kind of pain. One evening, I asked him directly, carefully, if anything had changed between us. He looked surprised, then mildly irritated. He told me I was overthinking, that I should trust him, that nothing inappropriate was happening. His voice was calm, almost rehearsed. I nodded. I apologized for bringing it up. The conversation ended quickly, neatly, but something inside me hardened just a little. Not into anger, into clarity, because reassurance shouldn't feel like dismissal. That night, lying awake beside him, I understood something I hadn't allowed myself to consider before. Even if nothing physical had happened yet, something had already shifted beyond repair. And whether I confronted it or not, the truth was moving forward without my permission. Pause for a second. What would you have done in my position? Would you have confronted him right then, or waited and watched? Drop your answer below. I really want to know. I chose to wait, not because I was afraid, but because I needed to be certain of him and of myself. Waiting didn't bring clarity the way I thought it would. It brought confirmation. It happened in pieces, not all at once. Small truths stacking up until denial became more exhausting than acceptance. I stopped asking questions and started noticing answers that arrived without being requested. One morning, I came downstairs early and found them already awake. Not working, just sitting at the table together. Coffee pod, plates out. The kind of quiet intimacy that usually belongs to people who don't need to explain themselves. They looked up at me in sync. Nothing was said, but something passed between them, a shared awareness that I had just walked into a scene already in progress. I told myself that meant nothing, that I was projecting. Still, I felt like a guest in my own kitchen. Later that day, I found her jacket hanging in the hallway closet. Not the guest room, our closet, slid in between his coats, like it had always belonged there. That was the first time my chest tightened in a way I couldn't talk myself out of. That jacket was the micro-betrayal. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was deliberate. Someone had chosen that space. Someone had decided where she fit. And it wasn't temporary. I didn't say anything. I just stood there longer than necessary, my hand still on the hanger, absorbing the quiet finality of it. A few nights later, I heard them arguing. Not loudly, but urgently. I stayed in the bedroom, not because I was afraid to interrupt, but because I knew, instinctively, that whatever they were discussing wasn't meant for me. Her voice cracked. His dropped low, and my name came up in a sentence that ended with silence. I didn't need to hear the rest. That was when the reality I'd been circling finally settled. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't miscommunication. This was a life happening alongside mine, without my consent. I confronted him the next morning. I didn't accuse. I didn't raise my voice. I asked him, plainly, if there was something he needed to tell me. He looked tired, not guilty, tired, like someone who had been waiting for this conversation but resented that it had finally arrived. He didn't deny it. He said things had evolved, that the lines had blurred, that I wouldn't understand because I'd changed. I listened. I let him finish, and when he paused, I asked the one question that still mattered to me. Do you still see me as your wife? He didn't answer right away. That silence did more damage than any confession could have. I need you to understand, this wasn't just betrayal. This was my whole life collapsing. Have you ever been blindsided like this? If you've been there, share your story below. We heal better together. Later that evening, the truth surfaced fully, not in an argument, but in a correction. We were all in the living room. I don't remember how the conversation started, only how it ended. He was frustrated. She was standing. I was seated, holding something I'd stopped reading. He gestured toward me and said it, casually, almost kindly. She's my real wife, he said. Emily's just the nanny. There was no room left for interpretation. I felt heat rise to my face, then fade just as quickly. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I nodded once, like someone receiving instructions. And in that moment, something inside me went very still. Not broken. Finished. I went upstairs and closed the door behind me. I sat on the edge of the bed and let the weight of what I'd ignored finally land. Not just his betrayal, but my participation in my own erasure. All the moments I'd explained away. All the space I'd surrendered in the name of being understanding. I realized then that staying wasn't loyalty anymore. It was permission. That night was the lowest point, not because of what he said, but because of what I finally saw. There was nothing left to negotiate. No misunderstanding to resolve. The marriage I believed in no longer existed in the way I'd understood it. I packed a bag quietly, not as a statement, not as a threat, as an acknowledgement. And as I folded my clothes, I felt something unfamiliar settle in, not strength, not anger, but resolve. I didn't leave to make a point. I left to regain one. That distinction mattered to me. Even then, I packed only what I needed for a few days. Clothes that felt like mine. Documents. My laptop. I avoided anything that felt symbolic. This wasn't a dramatic exit. It was a practical one. I moved through the house quietly, deliberately, as if sudden movements might pull me back into a version of myself I had already outgrown. Before dawn, I stood in the hallway and looked around one last time. Not with nostalgia, with assessment. I was already learning to see clearly. I didn't wake him. I didn't say goodbye to her. I left a note on the kitchen counter that said only this: I need space. I'll be in touch when I'm ready. I meant every word. I stayed with a friend the first night. I didn't explain everything. I wasn't ready to hear my life out loud yet. Instead, I slept. Deeply, like my body had been waiting for permission to rest. The next morning, I made a list. Not of demands, not of plans for revenge, of boundaries. I wrote down what I would no longer accept. Being dismissed, being minimized, being made to feel optional in my own marriage. The list wasn't long, but it was firm. Writing it steadied me in a way I hadn't expected. I began to think about what walking away actually meant. Not emotionally, legally, practically, financially. I wasn't panicking. I wasn't scrambling. I was collecting information. Quietly. That's something people don't talk about enough. Leaving doesn't always look like chaos. Sometimes it looks like calm, focused preparation. I spoke to a lawyer. Not to file anything, just to understand my options. I asked questions I'd never imagined needing to ask. About property. About shared accounts. About what protections existed if someone had been misrepresented to you from the start. The answers unsettled me, but not in a way that made me retreat. They clarified something important. I wasn't crazy for feeling displaced. I wasn't overreacting. And I wasn't wrong to trust my instincts, even if I'd delayed listening to them. That was the first moment of external validation I'd had since everything began. Someone neutral, trained, and removed from the emotion confirmed that my confusion had a basis. That mattered more than I expected. I didn't tell my husband any of this. I didn't need to. My silence wasn't a strategy, it was protection. In the days that followed, he called. He texted. His messages shifted in tone, from annoyed to conciliatory to defensive. I didn't respond. Not because I was trying to punish him, but because I was learning to pause before re-entering a conversation that had never allowed me to finish a sentence. I spent time alone. Long walks, quiet meals, moments where grief surfaced unexpectedly, not for him, but for the version of myself that had believed so fully in something that hadn't been reciprocal. That grief didn't make me weaker. It made me honest. By the fourth day, I knew I couldn't go back the way things were. Not to confront, not to negotiate, only to conclude. I planned the return carefully. I would collect the rest of my belongings. I would speak when necessary. I would leave again, this time without ambiguity. This wasn't about winning. It was about not disappearing. Here's where I made my choice. Do you believe in revenge or in walking away? When someone destroys your trust, what's the right move? Comment below. I want both sides. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. Because sometimes when you finally choose yourself, consequences start moving in ways you didn't anticipate. I arrived at the house mid-morning. I hadn't announced it. I didn't think I needed to. My name was still on the deed. My things were still inside. I parked down the street and walked the last few steps slowly, grounding myself in the physical act of moving forward. The front door was unlocked. That was the first beat. Inside, the house felt altered, not rearranged, just occupied differently. Her shoes by the door, her voice upstairs, his laughter following it. I didn't call out. I set my bag down and moved toward the hallway, already mentally sorting what I would take first. Then the doorbell rang. Not sharp, not urgent, just firm. I stopped. So did they. Footsteps on the stairs. Confusion in his voice when he asked who it was. She didn't answer. I opened the door before either of them reached the bottom step. 2 police officers stood there. Calm, neutral, purposeful. Emily Parker, one of them asked. Yes, I said. My husband froze behind me. I didn't turn around, but I felt it, the shift in his posture, the sudden loss of control. The officer explained, carefully, that they were there to follow up on a report. A discrepancy. Some documentation that hadn't aligned the way it should have. I listened. I nodded. My husband interrupted. Too quickly. Too loudly. There must be some mistake. The officer didn't react to him at all. That was the second beat. They asked to come inside. They asked to speak to all of us. They asked for identification. Papers. Timelines. The conversation moved fast, and for the first time since I'd known him, my husband didn't know where to stand. Details surfaced in fragments. Business registrations filed under overlapping names. A marriage license I had never seen, dated years before ours. A living arrangement that contradicted what had been declared legally. Her face changed first, then his. This is a civil matter, he said, trying to regain footing. The officer shook his head slightly. Not entirely. That was the third beat. They separated us. Not aggressively. Procedurally. I sat at the dining table while the other officers spoke to them in the living room. I could hear raised voices now, not shouting, but cracking. Authority had shifted, and it was visible. This is the moment everything changed. Be honest. Are you rooting for me right now, or do you think I went too far? Tell me in the comments. I can take it. When they came back to me, the officer's tone softened. Not sympathetic, respectful. You didn't file the report, he said. No, I answered. He nodded, like that mattered. They explained that an investigation had been triggered by something unrelated to me, a routine audit, a flagged inconsistency. My absence hadn't caused this. My silence hadn't delayed it. The truth had been moving forward on its own. I felt something release in my chest. Not relief. Validation. I wasn't imagining things. I wasn't overreacting. And I wasn't the problem they'd tried to quietly work around. They asked if I wanted to retrieve my belongings with an escort. I declined. I didn't need it anymore. When the officers left, the house was silent. He looked at me like he wanted to speak, like he needed to explain. I held his gaze, steady, neutral, and waited. He didn't find the words. She sat down heavily, suddenly unsure of her place. I picked up my bag. No one followed me to the door. Outside, the air felt different, lighter, not because I'd won, but because something dishonest had finally been named without my having to fight for it. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The truth had already stepped into the room, and it hadn't asked for permission. After that morning, things didn't fall apart all at once. They unraveled. I moved into a small apartment a week later. It wasn't temporary, but it wasn't permanent either. It was a pause, a place to exist without explanation. I furnished it slowly. Only what I needed. A bed, a table, a chair by the window where I drank my coffee in silence. I didn't rush to tell people what had happened. Word spread anyway, not through gossip, through adjustment. Invitations changed. Questions came more carefully. People who had known us as a unit began addressing me as an individual again. That was the social mirror I hadn't expected. Friends spoke to me differently, not with pity, with respect, as if something about how I'd handled things had recalibrated their understanding of me. I was no longer the accommodating wife. I was the woman who had left. That carried weight. The legal process moved slowly. I won't pretend it was clean or satisfying. It was procedural, sometimes exhausting, sometimes oddly impersonal. But the facts mattered, and for the first time, I didn't feel like I was arguing my reality into existence. There were still unresolved pieces, questions that would never be answered fully. I didn't know when the shift had really happened, or whether he'd ever planned to tell me the truth. I didn't know which moments had been real and which had been placeholders. I learned to sit with that uncertainty. There were losses I hadn't anticipated, mutual friends who chose distance, traditions that no longer belonged to me. The quiet grief of realizing that a future you'd been planning for doesn't disappear. It just stops being yours. But there were gains too, subtle ones. I slept better. I trusted my reactions again. I stopped second-guessing discomfort the moment it surfaced. That alone changed how I moved through the world. Looking back now, I wonder if I'd do it the same way again. What about you? Was the pain necessary to become who you are today? Let me know below. I still think about that version of myself, the one who believed patience could fix anything. I don't judge her. She did what she knew how to do with the information she had. And I don't feel anger toward them anymore. Not because they desire forgiveness, but because carrying it would require more energy than they are worth. What remains unresolved is quieter than rage. It's the understanding that trust, once broken this way, doesn't shatter loudly. It dissolves, and learning to live without it, or to rebuild it elsewhere, takes time. I'm still in that time. Not healed, not bitter, just aware. And that awareness, I've learned, is its own kind of stability. What I understand now is simple, but it took a long time to accept. I didn't lose my marriage all at once. I lost it in increments, each time I explained away a feeling that deserved attention. The consequences didn't come because I demanded justice. They came because the truth doesn't stay hidden forever, no matter how carefully people build around it. When it finally surfaced, it didn't restore what I'd lost, but it confirmed something I needed to know. I had not imagined my displacement. I had not exaggerated my doubt. And trusting myself sooner would not have made me cruel. It would have made me honest. That realization didn't bring comfort. It brought clarity. And clarity, I've learned, lasts longer. So here's my final question. Is it better to forgive and move on, or to make sure they understand exactly what they lost? There's no wrong answer. Drop it in the comments. So that's my story, folks. If it resonated with you, go ahead and hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I want to know how far Emily Parker's voice travels. Some truths don't save us, they return us to ourselves.